Hello, everyone. Welcome into the Guilty as Charged podcast. Bolt breakdowns here on the channel. We are, by the time this goes up tomorrow, 1 day away from the draft. Same time that I recorded, I believe, with Jake last year. And just hard to believe that it's almost here. Draft always goes by so quickly. Jake, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. I always enjoy talking to you, Alex, and I've said this to you before. I said this to you last year. It's nice when you kind of get the pessimistic point of views together a little bit, the realist point of views coming together.
Yes.
As a much just like relaxing vibe about it, to where you're just like, you know what? These are my people right here. I enjoy this.
You don't have to deal with that. I love Dan, but he's the high energy optimism just sometimes like you got to bring the mood down a little bit.
I just got to pull him back just a little bit. There's nothing wrong with being positive and all that type of stuff, but sometimes, you just got to bring the balloon down to earth a little bit.
Of course. Well, something that regardless of, well, I don't want to say regardless of who the Chargers pick, but everyone's still excited about what's going to happen in 24 hours when the Chargers do pick at 21, or maybe they trade back, maybe they trade forward, who knows. I guess, what are your thoughts based on, your evaluation of prospects throughout this whole process? What do you kind of think the Chargers are gonna do, and then what do you kind of want them to do?
I mean, easy want to is trade back. I've been wanting them to execute a trade back regardless of the round for what feels like the last decade, essentially, especially when you look at the value for players in this draft, who's projected to be there. I know you personally have your own opinions on this wide receiver class, so I know you've had a lot to say about that in terms of value goes at 21. But when you look at it as far as how the projection, or let's just say like the heat of this wide receiver class has come down so far as first round grades goes. And when you think about any wide receiver that's going to come in here for the Chargers is basically going to step in at least for the first year as a wide receiver 3 or 4. If that's someone that you could eventually groom into a wide receiver 2, I think there's a plethora of guys that you can target on day 2 and 3 that could eventually fit that mold for them. Now, what do the Chargers target at 21 if it's not a trade back? Everybody's talking about Bijan Robinson, and I understand why. The value there would just be absolutely tremendous. What Kellen Moore could possibly do with him in this offense is going to be a sight to see. And whether or not that is going to be an offense that's going to include Austin Eckler, it would still be a lot of fun to watch. Me personally, though, I feel like you got to address that edge position. You got to address that in some form or fashion. You have to think of it from a standpoint of beyond the years of Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa. If this is going to be someone that can contribute as a rotational edge rusher for you in year 1, which is absolutely possible for the Chargers to target at 21, or if they trade back from that, you can still find someone that you could develop into a premier pass rusher beyond this year and be a staple of your defense for the years to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think edge is certainly, you talk about Brandon Staley and what he's wanted to do on that defense, and the Chargers had this vision with Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack, and hopefully we still get to see that in 2023 with both of them healthy. But they've always wanted those kinds of high-end pass rushers, and that's going to go beyond Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack, as you said, into the future of what this Chargers team kind of ends up being. And so there's a plethora of guys they can kind of take there at the edge position. The Bijan stuff is interesting because there's team don't draft a running back in the first no matter what, and then there's team obviously Bijan. I am personally more pro Bijan than I think many out there, but then you do have sort of the people in the analytics community, those who I respect, even like Arjun, who said that he would kind of be more disappointed with the Bijan pick because of the value of that position, the likelihood that they make it to a second contract, all of these kinds of factors to consider. I guess because people are talking about it, why don't we open the can of worms? How would you feel about Bijan Robinson at 21?
I would fully understand why the Chargers would do that at 21 if they made that selection. Bijan is one of those running backs who bucks the trend of the whole notion of you don't draft a running back in the first round. He literally is that dynamic. There's so many ways that you can use him in an offense. At the same time, though, you have to understand the risk and reward to that. If the Chargers decide to go BPA and select Bijan as a luxury pick, which in the big picture, that's what that would be, you then have to have a lot of luck fall to you on days 2 and 3 of the draft for the positions that you really need. And whether we're talking about wide receiver, tight end, or edge, if you're going to spend a first round pick on a player like Bijan Robinson, like I said, I fully understand every reason why it's tremendous value, but you're going to need some luck to fall to you in the following rounds after that if you're hoping to get some of the players that we've projected to possibly go, players that we've talked about that we would want on this team. So yeah, it's not going to be as easy, I guess, to fill out those roster needs if Bijan Robinson was the selection at 21.
Yeah, I think it would be a little bit tougher going down the draft. And, running back in this draft, and this is another thing that I think people have been talking about. Do you take Bijan in round one, or do you sort of settle for like a Tyjae Spears or a Kentre Miller type of player in round three, round four of the draft, right? So that kind of comes into that calculus. And then if you're taking someone in the third or fourth round, then, kind of playing out the rookie contract isn't so much a problem, or not re-signing them to a contract isn't so much a problem if they do reach that state. But yeah, I think that for me, I'm more pro Bijan at 21 because of the prospect, right? That you are getting a top 5 blue chip prospect. In my opinion, the guy who's the best running back in the draft probably since Ezekiel Elliott. Some people would say since Saquon, but no matter what, I think the Chargers, that is a slam dunk pick if you do have it. This kind of brings us to the conversation of trading back now, because if Bijan's there, I don't think they would trade back. If Bijan's not there, if some of the receivers they like are off the board, maybe even one of the tight ends gets overdrafted, now you're looking at a board that maybe is a little bit more favorable for a trade down, or even if someone they like is available a little bit later on. I guess the way that I would put it with Tom Telesco in terms of trading down is, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me for 10 years, then that might be shame on you a little bit.
Yes.
But I guess to quote Patrick Mahomes, I'll see it when I believe it. But yeah, this is. I hope that he does it, but this is also the same GM that traded a second and a sixth for Khalil Mack, and then traded 2/7 to go get that 6th round pick back. So like Tom Telesco has always kind of been more on the attack in these rounds, more on the offensive when it comes to, getting players over like pick draft capital value. So I'll be curious to see if there really is a chance they trade down. I do think there is one that is higher, I guess, than relative to other drafts. I do think the chance of trading down is higher, but I still kind of need to see it to believe it. So I guess make your pitch for trading back, and then what do you think is the chance of it actually happening?
I mean, if all these things that we've heard from all of these teams saying that they have 15 to 20 players with first round grades in it, I mean, that should tell you everything you need to know about the top end value for this draft. So that should already start to make your case that not only the Chargers, but I'm sure a number of teams are going to look to trade down, probably starting in the teens, that they're going to start wanting to trade down. And for the Chargers standpoint, let's talk about it from the financials. You don't have the salary cap that you had last year to play with to fill a number of your holes. And we're talking about a year where we're going into where we know we need to get Justin Herbert under contract. I think this is a critical year as it relates to Brandon Staley and Tom Telesco's tenure with this team. They have to be able to hit on this draft class and have them come in and contribute. And am I talking about immediate contributors? Obviously, you can't make immediate contributors out of every one of them. But if you give yourself enough swings at the plate to have picks like that, look, I mean, teams have done it historically. It's like, example, even teams with 8 to 10 picks that they have drafted historically, has that turned around their franchise? No, it's not a foolproof formula. But for the Chargers, they need to do something different in order to start contending with Kansas City. They need to come into this with a different mindset of that. So from a financial standpoint, from a draft value standpoint, from just getting a number of players in at a low rookie salary when you're going to be paying your quarterback in the near future, I think that makes all the sense in the world for them to do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, picking up extra rookie contracts, is always super valuable too. And we've talked about, I guess last year they've pretty much had 7 or 6 every year. But Tom Telesco kind of played around the podium. It's like, who knows how many picks we're gonna have? Is it gonna be 6? Is it gonna be 8? Right. But if you do have 8 rookie contracts as opposed to 7 for that 4-5 year period, right? I do think that does play more value, especially if those guys are contributing. I guess that's going to be the interesting thing to watch with how they manage the cap situation. we did talk about Bijan a little bit earlier, so I'll talk about another running back in Austin Eckler. Um, Tom Telesco sort of seemed to indicate that Austin Eckler does not affect their draft process as they're going through it and how that situation can play out. Could he get traded? Could he get extended? Do you think that's true, or do you kind of think the Chargers have that in the back of their mind as they are operating in this draft?
It's hard to kind of figure that one out because Tom Telesco is almost the equivalent of Matt Millen for consecutive years of drafting one position. He's drafted a running back the last 3 years to try to back up Austin
Right.
Eckler. I don't think that that's going to prohibit him from possibly drafting another running back given the contract situation. So you could take from that whatever it is that you want to. As far as Austin Eckler's contract goes, I still believe that based on how the market has shaped out for him, unfortunately, that he will be back with the Chargers. Now, whether or not that's going to be in a backfield with Bijan or not, or the Chargers are going to target running back in the later rounds, I think that all those options are on the table for Tom. So I think that that's kind of what he alluded to. So whether Austin is back or not, whether or not he's going to prioritize running back high in this draft or not, I don't think it changes his mind. I still think in one form or fashion, he's going to try to get a running back that could come in and contribute to this group.
Right, yeah. And I think the fact that he has drafted so many running backs, like on one hand, it's like, yeah, but he doesn't also have the value of like Larry Roundtree's contract anymore, right? Because he was waived, put on the practice squad. Isaiah Spiller, he said at the press conference he wants to kind of see more from him. And I do think he'll probably get some more run this year. But Joshua Kelly and Austin Eckler, assuming Austin Eckler does play out the season, are both free agents next year. And so from that standpoint, you're looking, everyone asks, why do we have 4 running backs? It's like, well, you might not, right, coming up soon. And so I do think that even if you're sort of thinking about this more forward thinking, like we talked about with Edge and Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa, it's kind of impossible to not think about what the future is. And then, of course, back a couple of years ago when the Chargers were in this contract situation with Melvin Gordon, they had a former undrafted free agent who sort of ballooned his way up the roster over the years and was a starting running back in Eckler at the time, right? So they didn't draft anyone to necessarily replace Melvin Gordon at the time, but they already had their solution on roster. So I do think this time it is a little bit different. I guess going past day 1 of the draft, which will obviously be fun, who are some of your favorite sleepers, I guess, on day 2, day 3 that you think could really pack a punch for this Chargers team?
I mean, sleepers. I don't think know if you can necessarily consider someone on day 2 sleepers, but I mean, some of your favorite prospects that you look at. I have this theory, just the way that we know that Brandon Staley prioritizes DBs in this draft, and you never want to shy away from it. Don't be surprised if Brandon Staley targets DBs high in this draft, and that could even include the first round. Who knows what that could entail, depending on how the board falls to them. Marvin Mims, I think, would be a fantastic addition to this wide receiver group, given what he does in the return game. Bring him in as a wide receiver 3 and 4, watch him develop. I think he's going to add tremendous juice both in the offense and on special teams. Other guys that I really like, I'm a huge Sidney Brown fan. I know that we haven't been talking about safety that much, but in terms of the chess piece that most people talk about with the possibility of Brian Branch and pairing him next to Derwin James, I think you insert Sidney Brown into this defense and he could do a lot of the same things as far as playing multiple positions. And if the Chargers were going to target a DB, he's one of those guys that I think fits that versatility mold that Brandon Staley and Tom Telesco really covet. Tuli Tuipulotu, I think, would be great as a second day edge rusher if the Chargers chose to target that. In terms of just general fit goes, when are they going to target the interior of the defensive line? When are they going to shore up that interior of the offensive line? Who knows? But there's so many ways to go. I'm not sure if you would necessarily call any of those guys sleepers by now, with as much as we've had our hands in draft season. But those are just some guys that come to the top of my head as far as guys that would come in and be fantastic fits for this team. Those would be slam dunks in my opinion.
Yeah, I think Tui Tuipulotu, he was a guy that I believe in Mel Kiper's first mock draft of the season, he had the Chargers taking him at 21. And then, the draft process plays out, and now suddenly that guy is available in rounds 2 and 3, right? In the era of guys rising, guys falling. So if you do get more value there, I know there's people who are just tempted, and I'm tempted to do this sometimes, where you just go wide receiver, running back, tight end in the first 3 rounds, and go
Exactly.
go all offense and assemble it around Herbert. But then it's like, okay, but we have to remember who our coach is, right? Brandon
Right.
Staley is a former defensive coordinator. He is the defensive coordinator of this team, in terms of play calling and getting the personnel and all that. So for me, in that sense, I do still think, like you said, I wouldn't be surprised if corner was the first pick of day two, personally, because you look at guys like Julius Brents who are out there from
Yes.
Kansas State. Corey Trice from Purdue is also a guy that I really like a lot. But, Michael Davis, like we talk about, is a free agent after this year. You have the J.C. Jackson situation kind of in terms of when he's going to play in the air this year. Tom Telesco did express, some optimism this week that he might be able to actually come back by training camp, which would be fantastic. But I do still think you have to talk about this quarterback room as a group that is a little bit in flux right now. And so if you can get one of those big, Brandon Staley, 6', 6'2", 6'3"
Oh
DBs,
yeah.
and put them on the outside and just forget about the rest, right? Like that is kind of the dream in terms of like fortifying this defense and getting, Michael Davis is obviously CB1 last year. They intended J.C. Jackson to be, but no matter what happens in the future, having a guy that like kind of really fits that mold, I do think is one of the enticing things about corner in this class, and just how highly thought of the cornerback and tight end classes in particular are in this draft.
Yeah, I mean, Deontay Banks is a guy who's been mocked to the Chargers at 21 for crying out loud. I mean, and that wouldn't even surprise me either if that situation ended up playing itself out. If Emmanuel Forbes was 20 pounds heavier,
Yep.
I would love to see Emmanuel Forbes in this team. I think he is such a highly intelligent corner, exactly the type of guy that you would want to insert in this defensive back room. The cornerback class is just like you said; it's so versatile. It's one of the deeper position groups of this entire draft, and there are so many guys that fit that Brandon Staley mold, as you said, Alex, that could just come in and really, as you had mentioned, because you're not just buying insurance for J.C. Jackson, you're buying it for Michael Davis as well, because he may not be with this team after next year. So you really have to use your forward thinking on it. And Brandon Staley always says you can never have enough DBs.
Yeah, in the same mold of being taller and heavier. Man, I wish Trevius Hodges Tomlinson was like 3 inches taller
Right,
and maybe
right,
30 pounds heavier,
right.
because he would be a perfect fit in this defense too. But then
Yes.
you think about pairing him with Asante Samuel Jr. and you're like, I don't know if I want that in my
Yeah.
run defense that we need to improve. But yeah, I do think that is interesting in terms of how they'll prioritize corner and some of these other positions. Um, I guess what is a need in this draft that you don't think enough people are talking about? I think in mock drafts, the position that I lean to is actually interior defensive line. That's the one that I personally think of a lot with, obviously Austin Johnson coming back from injury this year. Otito Ogbonya coming back from the same injury that J.C. Jackson is in the torn patella tendon. Sebastian Joseph Day, I think, is a really great pass rusher, but he's not necessarily like a dominant run defender, right? That to me is a position where I think the Chargers could take a guy that maybe people aren't, and it's not sexy to draft interior defensive line in your mock draft and then post that to Twitter. But that is a position that I could see, not like a true necessarily like nose tackle like Siaki Ika for the Chargers, just because of this defense and what it requires. But I do think they could end up going with that position earlier. What's that position for you?
I actually feel fully in line with you on that. Interior defensive line, when you look at what has it been, 3 guys, because you lost Gaziano in free agency. You lost Fajoko in free agency. You let Tillery walk last year. As you mentioned, you're bringing back Austin Johnson and Tito off of injury. Sebastian Joseph Day and Morgan Fox are really the ones that that are 100% healthy. You need some depth. Let's not forget this Chargers run defense was one of the worst that they have ever had. One of the worst in the league last year. And you have to figure out a way to shore that up. And it would not surprise me that, when when they walk into training camp on the first day, that they're just getting rolls of clips of the 40-yard gashes that opponents were just getting against this defense all year last year. So they have to prioritize that at some point. Now, I think the reason that a lot of people haven't been talking about it is because we've seen some strange mock drafts with like Mozzie Smith all of a sudden getting projected to the Chargers at 21. I think it's where you prioritize it. So is it a priority? Yes. Would I consider it a priority necessarily over wide receiver, edge, and tight end? Maybe not necessarily. So where do the Chargers, consider to start prioritizing that? Do you look more in the middle rounds at a Kobe Turner, a Cameron Young, a Carl Brooks, for example, to target more in the mid rounds? So for a guy coming in as more of a rotational depth piece, I would say that conversation probably doesn't start until at least day 3, depending on how many picks the Chargers have. If they're able to execute a trade back, that may change things a little bit. But I'm definitely in conjunction with you as far as interior defensive line is not being talked about enough as far as a priority for this team.
Cameron Young was the Chargers pick in the fake mock draft rehearsal they did. I don't think he's gonna go. I don't think he's gonna go in the first round.
Yeah. So okay. So they that in the fake one they took him in the first round. Okay. So
so they basically prioritize him. They basically just threw a bunch of random names in a generator. So you had like Andre Iosivas from Princeton in like the first round, and like it was just all these names scattered across the board, which is just like a nightmare for someone who's been on like if you God forbid you use the PFF mock draft simulator and you take a pick like 10 picks before it's supposed to go, they just grade your draft a D, and then you can't do anything about it.
Player rankings are just so all over the place when we're doing these mock drafts. Like I try to stay as realistic as possible with mine, and so when I see Sidney Brown still sitting there in the 4th, while I would love to take him, like he's not going to be there in the 4th, so I'll go elsewhere and stuff like that. But it's always interesting seeing the differentials between mock drafts and how they have these players ranked.
Yeah, there's pros and cons to doing that, because I remember, doing 2021 mock drafts with Steven and Tyler, and every single mock draft, it's like, Sean Slater's still on the board. He's not going to be there. These teams are dumb in this simulation. And then suddenly, Sean Slater's there at 13 at draft day, right? Or even Zion Johnson last year. I do think some of the draft falls are interesting. I probably think Bijan probably has a better chance of being there at 21 than maybe even Rashawn at 13 like a couple of years ago, just because of positional value and all those things. But it's weird that, especially this year with the lack of consensus at the top and all the GMs saying, we have no idea what's going to happen. This draft seems to be at least predictable than, many drafts in the past. So I guess I'll ask you the question now. I put a gun to your head. Who is the Chargers pick at 21?
Chargers pick at 21. It's always interesting because now we don't have the luxury of thinking of the position that we had 2 years ago when Rashawn Slater was there at 13 to kind of know what the board's going to look like. And like you said, who really knows what the board is going to look like when the Chargers hit 21? Me personally, I don't believe that Bijan's going to be there. I think he's going to be taken before the change. Yeah, Zay Flowers is another guy who I know is popular among Chargers fans. I also don't think that he's going to be there, as much as I would love to see him in a Chargers uniform and the type of explosion that he could bring to this offense. I have still kind of stuck to my guns a little bit and kept to the defensive side of the ball. I wouldn't even consider Will McDonald that much of a reach if the Chargers ended up selecting him at 21. I think he is so athletic as an edge rusher. And I think that I just love everything that I see about his game, and what he can contribute to this defense, I think would be substantial. So I would totally be comfortable with a pick like that. And yeah, I'll go with Will McDonald at 21. And regardless of whether that ends up being in a trade back or not, I'll still stick to Will McDonald. That just seems like the wheelhouse for him right there, and in between that 21 and 25 realistic spot for him to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of can operate in a lot of mock drafts with the defensive picks. Did one with Brian Branch earlier this week. You can talk about, obviously, Will McDonald. I still do think, and I put this in my final mock draft, like, Michael Mayer just makes too much Telesco sense for me to like not think that he's gonna be the guy. Maybe they trade down to 27 and take him or something. That'd be a dream scenario. But even at 21, I think you kind of look at him having the bona fides, that Rashawn Slater and Zion Johnson did, just as these like super like very high ceiling, or I would say high floor prospects, right? Where there's a very low chance that that player is kind of considered like a bust in the league. I do think that when you look at Michael Mayer, even that he's not the explosive athlete that Zay Flowers is, for example, right? I do think him as a blocking tight end in this Kellen Moore scheme. I think Kellen Moore would love to have him. It's kind of funny that Kellen Moore leaves from the Cowboys to the Chargers, and all the Cowboys fans want Dalton Kincaid. All the Chargers fans, are sort of thinking the pick will be Mayer. Although we do have a Utah contingent and Steven, who obviously is singing the praises of Dalton Kincaid.
Yes.
But yeah, I just think Michael Mayer at this point probably is the Chargers pick. If I had to guess, but obviously there's plenty of scenarios that could happen with Bijan falling down the board or just absolute chaos happening. But I do think the Chargers are in a good position this draft compared to last year's, regardless, because of the quarterbacks. The fact that you're probably going to have at least 4 quarterbacks off the board, it kind of does make it like it's the 17th pick, right? Because you're talking about 21 minus 4, right? So it kind of does make it like you are selecting at 17 if you're not going to take a quarterback in this class. And maybe there's a team, I wouldn't advise it. Maybe there's a team that wants to trade up for Hendon Hooker. Please be my guest. We'll be there at 21 waiting right for you. But yeah, so Jake, any final thoughts as we wrap up this pre-draft talk?
Man, this whole draft offseason has just been wild. I know you guys, us collectively as Chargers fans, have just been itching for this day to come. We're 2 days out. We're 2 days, technically, when this pod airs, we're 1 day out. So I apologize for that. I'm just happy it's here, man. I always love the offseason, the draft chatter that goes along with everybody trying to predict what's going to happen. And the draft weekend is just pure chaos. And I'm going to basically glue myself to the couch for 3 days and enjoy every second of it.
And, we'll be there all the way along the way, when Tom Telesco takes some guy in the 4th round that none of us knew. He was on none of our draft boards, and then we're going to become experts on him in a period of 48 hours.
Right.
So that's usually how the draft works. Shout out Chris Rumpf. I didn't know who you were before the draft, but I sure knew who you were after. So I'm sure we'll have some of those Tom Telesco specials in this class. Excited to be along with you guys during the draft. We will have our live draft stream on Thursday on this channel, run by Steven and Tyler, with many guests throughout. Are you guys doing anything live for the draft?
So not live during the draft, but we
Right.
will be on for about 2 hours before draft time kicks off. So it'd be nice. The new house is done in the backyard. Bunch of the guys are coming down from the network. So it'll be good times, man. It'll be good times. We're excited for it. It's going to be a good weekend.
Check out everything Chargers Unleashed is doing on their YouTube channel, of course. And check out, I'm assuming you guys are going to be doing post-draft pods too, during the draft pods after the first round. So go check out everything Jake and Dan are doing on the channel. Dan, thanks for joining the show.
Appreciate it, man.
Bolt up and enjoy the draft, boys.